Hello, dear friends. This is José Luis Gomez, your music director of your Tucson Symphony Orchestra. Welcome again to a very, very special TSO performance with a release of selected excerpts from our archival recordings that are going to be made of the Beethoven celebration that we had during the 1920 season, our actual last performed season just before the pandemic, and in which we visited all the Beethoven symphonies, taking in consideration that his last symphony, the Symphony Number 9, was performed the season before. So we decided to do a cycle with the rest 8 symphonies. The Beethoven symphonies journey for an orchestra is very special. And for an orchestra and its music director, it's an opportunity to revisit and restudy and just digging even more into these wonderful works that stand by themselves as one of the most important parts of the repertoire of a symphony orchestra. And they also are works that demand different things from an orchestra. So getting the chance to listen to live recordings of the symphonies, it's an opportunity to kind of go back and live again that live music experience that we actually miss very much right now because of the pandemic. I have selected short excerpts in order for you to a little bit enjoy a little bit more concentrated certain aspects of each symphony. And of course, then you can decide listen to all different versions, but I'm sure these ones, and especially in these little excerpts, are going to take you back to that moment that you were with us in a music hall or at the Catalina Foothills Auditorium. This listening guide also, it's going to be, it's made in the order of the symphonies that we actually performed. So instead of just going chronologically, or instead of just going by, numeral order like 1, 2, 3, 4, I decided to also give you the excerpts in the same order that symphonies were performed during the season. And that order actually was something that we thought of very well, in the sense of, trying to give the audience a reason why starting with certain symphonies and why connecting one to another, and sometimes why 2 symphonies also were together in the same concert, as you may remember as well. But at the end of the day, I think, music speaks by itself, and especially the Beethoven symphonies are so magnificent that they really need very little introduction. Nonetheless, I'm going to guide you through each one of the symphonies, and I'm sure it will be an opportunity for you to enjoy a little bit more and just discover some of those little secrets that sometimes lie behind and the music itself, and we need to explore always a little bit more and more all of these little details. So let's start with the first one. The first one that we started the season actually was Symphony Number 7. That was the beginning of the cycle, but also the beginning of the season. And I think in that case, this symphony, it's a very easy choice. You cannot go wrong with Symphony Number 7. I think that symphony shows a Beethoven of maturity, a Beethoven of mastering the language of symphony and the symphony form better than his contemporaries, and also set a tone for the use of the orchestra in a way that other composers then, found of incredible inspiration. There is something about this symphony, and especially you will hear in the excerpt, because it's the ending of the first movement, that has this kind of almost never-ending rhythmical cell that repeats itself and kind of helps to build and create a climax to not only in the volume but also in the amount of musicians and instruments playing together. As maybe some of you know, this symphony is made of dances, different dances, and these dances some kind of repeat themselves during the symphony for a very obvious reasons of creating that sense of build up, of developing. This is something that other composers of note like Richard Wagner, a famous German composer of the end of the 19th century, found in Beethoven's symphonies this kind of a monument to imitate, and particularly this symphony, he called it the apotheosis of the dance, because from the very beginning to the last movement, it's all about dancing. It has all of these, this connection between, the movements that talked about dancing. So this first excerpt is just the ending of the first movement, and it has that kind of, message very clearly from that little crescendo that burst into a very brilliant and bright, a climax of sound. The next symphony is the Symphony Number 4. Well, the symphonies sometimes are a little bit less known of the catalog because of sometimes the presence in programming of the other ones that are famous, 7, 5, 6. Well, sometimes it's a little bit unfair that certain symphonies, especially the fourth, stays a little bit forgotten, but it's actually one of my favorite ones, and especially in this excerpt that we're hearing as well is the last movement. I mean, all the symphony itself, from the beginning to the end, it's very enigmatic. There's something very intriguing about it. It's not that straightforward as others. And also, imagine that this symphony stands right after the third, the Eroica, which has a very clear message, and is standing also behind the number 5, which is also a symphony that we all know that has that kind of very as well straightforward rhythmical musical message. So this one, the enigma, I think it's because standing in between all these two gives the symphony a little bit of that sense of elegance and poise. I think this symphony also is a good example how Beethoven was experimenting with the way the orchestra can sound and the different combination of instruments. It has very unique orchestration elements, but also I think in this case why I selected the last movement. It's a good example of how virtuosism translates into orchestra playing, because it gives a lot of elements of virtuosism because of the difficulty not only to the strings but also to wind instruments, to the bassoon especially, and the clarinets. It's one of those examples that I wanted to showcase of this symphony that has many other faces, especially the enigmatic one, the elegant one. It's a very elegant, symphony. The next one that we performed around December 2019 was the Symphony Number 5, and I left intentionally that symphony in the middle of the cycle because I wanted just to have a taste of the maturity of Beethoven with the 7th, then that enigmatic Beethoven with the 4th, and then the straightforwardness of the Symphony Number 5 that we now recognize immediately because of that rhythmical cell that tells a story. It tells many stories, but there is one that reflects a lot of what we always identify with the symphony, that destiny calling on the door, and somehow Beethoven what he's doing here is telling us how something very simple can become can develop into an actual very complex piece of music. The excerpt that I selected is just that ending of the development of the first movement and then into the coda, a very special coda in which you will hear how this rhythmical element of 4 beats, pam, 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 it's also, it's treated differently and up to the end, and you will hear it in the horns 2 times. You will hear how this insistence of this rhythmical cell becomes also expanded in time. So instead of just presenting it the same way, then he presents a little bit in the same rhythm, in the same speed that we're having in the symphony, where everybody's playing, non-stop. you will hear the horns playing, the rhythmical cell a little bit displaced in time, so it becomes a little bit longer. It's like telling you, listen to this in a slower and clear way. So it is a symphony that takes you always to different worlds, the world of again, of virtuosism, of orchestra virtuosism play, because it's not an easy symphony to play, even though it's very famous and it's performed all over the world. But also, it's a task. It's an important task to try to unveil as many of the different layers that the symphony has, and it's important for us as musicians not to stay in the surface and try to dig in even more. So this is always a great opportunity, for a performer to get his hands into this symphony, because it is an opportunity, as I said, to re-study, to engage all of these ideas that maybe you had time ago in the last performance that you had, and so you can just take them back and explore them again and even develop them more. The next two other symphonies are actually the first pair of symphonies that we had in two different concerts, and I wanted this pair to be the first one. So this pair was Symphony number 2 and 8, and we performed them around January 2020. And these two symphonies have a very special thing in common, which is, in my personal opinion, that side of Beethoven that sometimes we tend to forget, because we look at Beethoven as a very serious and kind of a little bit tormented character, but he had an amazing sense of humor. He as we know that from the people that knew him, sometimes it wasn't easy to be with him, but because of his struggles and his personal struggles, and especially with the loss of hearing. But sometimes the music that he writes give us a different side of him. So I think that's why we always need to listen carefully, because music was the language actually that Beethoven spoke the best. That was coming from his internal world, and his internal world, apart from struggles, also had a lot of happiness and a lot of a little bit of jokes or sense of humor. The second, it's an example how Beethoven was already finding his own voice in between creating symphonies. This is a very early symphony that pays a lot of attention to another symphony master, which is Joseph Haydn. He was admired by not only Beethoven but also by Mozart before. And this symphony has a little bit of that structure, a very clear Haydnesque structure, but nonetheless it's a Beethoven symphony. So immediately from the first notes, from the first exposition of the themes, it tells us his own story, his own Beethoven language. It's a very playful symphony, and the excerpt that I selected is actually the last movement, which again, it's very fast, but also it has that kind of playful conversation between the instruments, and especially between the strings, between the violins and the flute, and that with that kind of wink of the eye a little bit that they're doing together. So I always imagine two people just joking each other and teasing each other. That would be the word, teasing each other with music, and it goes really easy in a way, but there is a lot of work in composing something like this. It's not as simple as it looks. The other one is the 8th Symphony. It's one of the late symphonies that Beethoven wrote, and actually, looking at that statement I was telling you at the beginning, that Beethoven was, showing a little bit does always that side of seriousness and the struggle that he was going through. With this symphony, actually, he's telling us that he looks at life totally in a different way. He's trying to show his most bright side, even though he was going through a very dark moment in his life. And this is a symphony that also if you take in consideration that it's one of his last symphonies, instead of looking forward, that he actually did, he's also looking at the past and embracing, the greatness of great classical style symphony. And this symphony is shorter, but also very charming. It has the sound of a mature Beethoven, even though it has a classical flavor, but it sounds like the Beethoven that is already in command of his language itself. It's very humorous as well, and especially with the excerpt that I selected, which is the second movement, which the story tells us, that he wrote this movement because he wanted to emulate this new tool, this new instrument called metronome, which is an instrument. It's actually a tool that we use in order to measure the beats in time. And so he, as you will hear in this movement, because it's very short, so that we could add it. It's complete. It's only 3 minutes something, and it starts with the oboes and the woodwinds, just showing us that beat, like a little clock, and that's something that he was trying to kind of maybe humorously tell us, that this new tool was discovered. So he was like, okay, let me try it and put music around it. So it's a very good example how Beethoven was able to even go beyond the serious, the depth probably, and the seriousness of the music, but without losing that intensity that characterizes his music as well, which is everything that he does it's actually this is not a joke. This is something very serious at the end. The next pair, as I mentioned before, was Symphony number 1 and 6, and I put them together also in a very special program that we played around February, at the beginning of February, because I wanted to show a little bit of the alpha and omega of Beethoven, a very early Beethoven, a very young, youthful, experimental Beethoven with Symphony number 1. And we will hear 2 excerpts, which is the first movement, and except from the first movement, especially the beginning, in which you will recognize that from the first notes of the first symphony he wrote, he's already changing the world of symphony. He's kind of, saying, hey, I'm Ludwig van Beethoven. I want to do what you guys are doing, what I'm learning from the great symphonists, but I want to do something totally different. He's that, very enigmatic as well, start the symphony with that dominant chord. And that means that it's like a little bit of, instead of starting with the first grade of the scale, which is normally, it's in the tonality of the symphony, which in this case is C major, he starts with the dominant. It's like if you take a book and instead of starting from the first page, you start from the last page. So this is something that for me, it's been always fascinating, that in his first symphony, he's just trying to break boundaries in music writing. So we have that beginning in the first movement excerpt, but also I wanted to show you that last movement, which is also a very good example of how certain languages of music, and especially a little recitativo kind of at the beginning of the last movement, that with the first violin is trying to tease you into what is going to be developed. I think it's very funny to listen to that. It's a little bit of a shows of Beethoven that is ready to be Beethoven. There is no question about it. And pairing the first symphony, which is the alpha of the symphonies of Beethoven, with the 6, even though it's not the omega because it's not the end, but it's actually the Beethoven, the mature Beethoven. So Symphony number 5 and 6 were performed together during Beethoven's time. It was the premiere or the debut of the symphonies were actually in the same concert. And the 6, as you know, it has a very, very special meaning, because it was a symphony that he intended to be programmatic, in the sense that he had a very clear story to tell, and the story that he chose was the story of nature. So he wanted to use music to take us to nature, to kind of describe with tones and sounds what nature was saying. And this is something that actually he wrote, intentionally in the score, also describing each movement, what it meant. but he said that the let's say the tone of explaining that he didn't wanted the listener just to identify specifics of nature with the music, but also just sensations. So you can even imagine that how then later on, in the 20th century, we have composers like Claude Debussy, establishing that sense of impressionism, in which was trying to explain things without words, just by sensation. So Beethoven did exactly the same thing with his own, obviously more classical language, but it's an incredible example of the mastery of Beethoven, a real mature and accomplished composer that was able to even take the music beyond. The two movements are the two excerpts of two movements that I selected are the first one, which is the first movement. It's one of the more famous melodic tunes of Beethoven as well, and it has a very beautiful title. It's The Awakening of Cheerful Feelings on Arrival in the Countryside. So it's already, the title is not telling you something specific, but it's just awakening cheerful feelings. It's incredibly fascinating to see how he was, or being such a poet in that sense, with music and also with words. And the third movement, it's called Merry Gathering of Country Folk. So that's a little bit more specific, but it's also using the music to express, that kind of, gathering of people and enjoyment of people, something that for sure we miss a lot because of the pandemic. So maybe this movement will give you a little bit of relief in thinking, and hoping that we go back to be able to gather together and dance and enjoy. The last symphony and the last excerpt of the list, it was the symphony actually we played, the last symphony we played, and it's a very special one because it's a symphony number 3, Eroica, and of course, it was actually the last symphony the TSO played just before the pandemic. It's incredible. For me, it's impossible to forget how special that was. Obviously, we were living in a very uncertain moments and of not knowing what was developing, but having the chance to go back and listen to that performance, it's also an opportunity for us to tell us that at least we said, a little bit of goodbye and see you later with music. And with the symphony number 3, is very special. This symphony was an example of how Beethoven was, already setting a statement of what he was also as a human being. He was a big advocate for the social cause, for liberty, for freedom. And so he wrote this symphony thinking of what was happening around him as a human being. And it was the French Revolution, as you know, the great thinkers and the great developers of society into a more equal society. So he wanted to dedicate this symphony to the figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. For him, was an example of someone that defended those values. What is interesting is that later on, the symphony, was dedicated to Napoleon, and then Beethoven knowing that Napoleon declared himself then an emperor. So all of those values were thrown away because of a will of power. Beethoven, who was very convinced about that, apparently just scratched the name of Napoleon with a lot of anger. We can imagine that because the manuscript has that scratch of the title, and then he's changed the title to dedicate it to the memory of a great man. So this is something that I really find important in this in the figure of Beethoven. He was someone that made no compromises to his beliefs, and the music itself, it has that personality set up. It's a very heroic symphony. It has that sense of pride and glory in many ways, in the themes, but also in the way the orchestra builds this message somehow. The excerpt that I selected is just the coda finale of the last movement. Last movement, it's a great example of how he as a composer was able to use a theme and then make different variations. But that last section, which starts a little bit with a more solemn treatment of the theme, it describes very much so the thematic content of the symphony, this heroic and solemn hymn or anthem for freedom and liberty and equality. As you know, he was very clear about this in his last symphony, but already in the Eroica, this message of brotherhood or important human values, it is reflected. So that's why I was very emotional as well listening to it, because it was a little bit of, for us, saying don't give up hope, because once everything is going to be safe, we're going to be back on stage and we're going to go through all of this great music again, and we will feel like that it's being only a little hiatus in the middle, in which where there is a lot of struggle, there is a lot of suffering, but I think music is always giving us that sense of relief and hope, especially. I think it's important through music for us to remember that an orchestra, a performer, an artist needs the people around them. It needs you. So that's why I think these elements that we're releasing for you on the digital stage are very meaningful to us, because it's the way to reach out to you and to communicate to you how much we miss you and how much we need us to be together again, and to have the chance and the incredibly serious and also important duty of transforming the life of the people around us and transforming them for good, like Beethoven was intending with his music, And the Tucson Symphony, it's here and it's going to be always here for you, for the community of Tucson, that amazing community that supports them and supports the TSO and supports the arts especially. And we are incredibly proud. I am incredibly proud to be a leader of an institution that resounds with that message of community. Thank you for listening. I hope you will enjoy this very special list of excerpts that have been played live by your Tucson Symphony Orchestra during the 1920 season. And what else can I say? That right now, in the meantime, just stay tuned for all the great content that we have in our digital stage. We have performances, we have great conversations with fantastic artists that we had during this last period of time, and as well as very enjoyable and fun content, which you get a chance also to meet our wonderful musicians that are actually the spinal cord of this institution. And this is just for us to tell you that we are incredibly excited for our imminent comeback to the stages next season, and to embrace music, live music again in the way that we always do, and we can wait for that to happen. Be safe, stay tuned, and I'll see you very, very soon. Goodbye.